the entire island of Cuba famously does not belong to the Cuban government. You see, this small part here, the southern part of Guantanamo Bay, has been home to an American naval base since 1903. And as you'll likely know, there have been points during that time where the Cuban and US governments really didn't get along. And throughout the premiership of Fidel Castro, when these relations were at their lowest point, he wasn't able to retake Guantanamo Bay for himself and his country. Which raises the obvious question, why not? Why didn't Castro and communist Cuba try to take Guantanamo Bay and make the island whole once more? So, to learn how Cuba ended up in this position, we've got to go back to the 19th century. Not you, not this time. In the closing years of which, the Cubans revolted against Spanish rule. Like most revolutionaries before them, the Cubans imagined that they would get to keep all of their territory upon independence. But fun fact, no. Their war against the Spanish soon caught the attention of the US of A, and after a main sinking, calls to remove Spain's last imperial territories from the Western Hemisphere grew rapidly. Now, many Americans wanted Spain out of Cuba, but that didn't necessarily mean that they wanted Cuba to be free. And so to preempt this, the less expansionist members of Congress passed the Teller Amendment, which as part of the act given President McKinley the right to intervene in Cuba, made it clear that the United States was not allowed to keep it. Now the government being forbidden from annexing Cuba is not the same as being forbidden from annexing any of it. And during the Spanish-American War, the United States found that Guantanamo Bay was well suited as a naval base, mostly because it gave much quicker access to the rest of the Caribbean, which was, pretty useful for keeping an eye on any European ambitions there. And so, after the Spanish were defeated, Cuba was occupied by the United States, which agreed to leave once the new independent government was up and running. Now this independence came at a price because the Americans had just passed the Platt Amendment, meant to override the Teller Amendment, and Washington not only wanted the naval base as well as this island, but also the perpetual right to intervene in Cuba should it do anything that threatened American interests there or in the region. This was begrudgingly agreed by the Cubans in 1901 because, honestly, what real choice did they have? And 2 years later, the United States built themselves a naval base in the bay, which they would lease for a small annual sum. This led the Americans to, by and large, ignore their claim on this island, and eventually it was just sort of agreed that it was now Cuba's. Over the next few decades, the United States routinely intervened against any destabilizing forces in Cuba, and, steadily began to economically dominate the island. This continued right up until the early years of the Cold War, during the fractured rule of President Fulgencio Batista. Batista, he had a great relationship with the United States in that he was, honestly, pretty happy to sell Cuba to it in return for Washington propping him up. And maintaining the base at Guantanamo Bay meant that the US and its help were never too far away for him. Over time, Batista became much more tyrannical, and so resistance to him, especially by students with communist sympathies, just increased massively. And soon enough, resistance turned into open rebellion. To combat this, Batista strengthened the military, which, kinda ironically, promptly tried to overthrow him but failed. He then opted for the tried-and-true response of purging the army, which did keep it loyal to him, but it also meant that the inexperienced people now running it weren't as capable of dealing with the rebels. So these rebels were, by and large, a mishmash of different groups with varying objectives, except for, the one thing they all agreed on, ousting Batista. That said, the largest and most effective group was the July 26th movement, led by a certain Fidel Castro. By 1958, those rebels were in control of several parts of Cuba, and after Batista rigged the end-of-the-year election, the United States stopped providing him with weapons, which, of course, made things a whole lot easier for the rebels. And within a couple of months, Batista had fled. The revolutionaries were in charge of the major cities, and the Cuban Revolution was over. Well, mostly, kind of. Well, not really. You see, the coalition of rebels were now in charge, and whilst they could put their differences aside fighting against a common enemy, when it became clear, though, that not everyone could get what they wanted, tensions rose. Castro was in charge of the most guys with guns, and so he got to choose the new interim president before telling said president to make him prime minister. He announced that there would be elections. But don't worry, he banned all opposing political parties too, so that he, on behalf of the people, could take all of that troublesome and tiring thinking out of the process. He would soon change his mind and ban elections altogether. But long story short, Cuba was now Castro's, barring the short-lived rebellion by his former associates. Now, it won't surprise you to learn that Castro and his fellow co-revolutionaries didn't believe that America's ownership of part of Guantanamo Bay was legitimate, and they argued that it was an agreement between the USA and a dead government, and thus was void, meaning that it would be nice if the US Navy just simply left. Now, running a country after overthrowing its government means that some things are naturally going to get overlooked. And one thing that the new communist government did was to cash the American check for the Guantanamo lease. Now, Castro claimed that this was an oversight, but the Americans quickly claimed that by accepting the money, the new rulers of Cuba had legitimized the lease, and so therefore, no back CIs. Obviously, that's not really how things work, because it's not like Eisenhower or any of his successors would have handed Guantanamo Bay over anyway. And in the decades following this, the Havana government was sure to never cash another one of those checks. And it maintained that the United States had absolutely no rights to the base or anything else on Cuba, which is why the government nationalized basically everything, and their former American owners got nothing in return. So Castro obviously wanted the Guantanamo territory back under Cuban control. But he wasn't a dummy. Whilst the US garrison there was small enough that he would have been able to capture it fairly quickly, it's not like the US would have just simply accepted that its soldiers had been killed and its territory attacked. In fact, not only did Castro and his government refuse to consider attacking the US base there directly, but during the first years of their rule, they were terrified of the Americans invading Cuba to remove them, which was a fair concern because that's what they wanted to do. Now, I know what you're thinking. This is because of the US's right to intervene in Cuba, part of its constitution if America's interests were ever threatened. But actually, it wasn't, because Franklin D. Roosevelt had given up that right in the 1930s to improve relations with Cuba. He still kept the base, though. That was just useful. Their fear actually came from the fact that the United States was a hegemonic superpower and could do whatever it wanted in the region with very little pushback. In response to Castro's takeover, President Eisenhower embargoed the country and began preparing for an invasion of Cuba. Not by the US military, though. Castro was seen as far too popular with the Cuban people, and the worry in America was that casualties would be far too high. Instead, this invasion would be undertaken by exiled Cubans who opposed the new government. Eisenhower left office before this plan could be enacted, but John F. Kennedy, his successor, went ahead with the operation. This invasion would take place here at the Bay of Pigs, and honestly, it did not go well. Castro quickly won, and as a result, his relationship with the USSR improved greatly, because they believed that if Cuba were to be uncommunistified, then it would make them look weak internationally. So as a result, the two intensified their military alliance, and the Soviet Union stationed nuclear weapons there, and thus, the Cuban Missile Crisis. During this, the US base on Guantanamo took a new importance for both sides. The Americans evacuated civilians from the base and massively reinforced the garrison there to deter any offensives from Cuba. This wasn't going to be a problem, though, because the Soviets there had just opted to point a nuclear missile at it, meaning that it would have been vaporized 15 seconds after everything went wrong. So, now Castro saw this crisis as an opportunity for him to try and regain Guantanamo. When the three nations started negotiating about how they could all, not die, Castro came up with his list of demands. He was hoping the US would agree to these in exchange for sending the nukes back home. First, he wanted the United States to end the economic embargo. Second, he wanted them to stop trying to assassinate him and overthrow his government. Third, the US had to respect Cuba's sovereign waters. Fourth, same deal for Cuba's airspace. And fifth, of course, he wanted Guantanamo Bay returned. But JFK honestly didn't want to do any of this, so he pulled something pretty clever. He told the USSR that this whole disagreement was just between the superpowers, and that Castro shouldn't be allowed to mess up negotiations that were, so important. Nikita Khrushchev, the Soviet premier, agreed, because let's face it, Castro was kind of tough to work with. By just ignoring Cuba's demands, JFK figured he had a better shot at getting what he wanted. Obviously, this was not what Castro had hoped for. But after the crisis ended, the Soviet Union promised to keep some troops in Cuba. At least that way, if the US ever invaded again, the Soviets would be forced to get involved. Outside of that, though, the Cubans really didn't get much out of the whole crisis. And the US? Not even for a second did they consider giving up their naval base. After this, the Cubans couldn't really do much about the Americans staying on their island. They wanted them gone. The Americans didn't want to leave. And honestly, with the massive power difference, the only way to get the Americans out was through some kind of diplomatic agreement. But Castro didn't have anything he could offer to make that trade worthwhile. So Cuba had to settle for, basically, diplomatic nagging. And yeah, it was kind of shocking to learn that this didn't work. And, well, the United States is still there to this day. I really hope you enjoyed this episode, and I want to give a special thanks to my patrons: James Bisonet, Sky Chappelle, Kartoska, YN Hockey, Anthony Beckett, Marvin Cassow, Winston Quood, Gustav Swan, Captain Sidog, Andy McGee, Alex Schwinn, Copper Tone, Robert C. Perkins, Ma Ahmed, AF, Firefly, Spencer Lightfoot, Castle Bravo, Rod D. Martin, Respectable Level of Chaos, Spinning 3 Plates, Arthur Hosey Jr., Udwan Wang, Shawen, Kim Un Yun, The McWare, Michael Halbert, The Jim Stannon, Kitro, The Flying Deutschland, Starry Nights, Bonnie Bounds, Jim Sternberg, Remco, Heusman, Betkabot, Lord Beak, and Charles I.